How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Today on the show, we're joined by fellow culture architect Gustavo Razzetti. Gustavo is the global CEO of Fearless Culture, and he's the author of Forward Talk, the bold new method for getting teams unstuck. He brings to the show 3 decades of experience in innovation, marketing, and of course, company culture. With his own company, Fearless Culture, Gustavo's consulting work has had a global reach, touching organizations in North and Latin America, Europe, Asia, Pacific. His latest book, Forward Talk, which we'll get into today, came out in early May of 2026, and it's as meaty and straightforward and systematic as it promises to be. Gustavo places communication at the center of culture building, and he introduces readers to the concept of conversation debt, which we're going to be diving into later. We're excited to hear all about the book and all about his journey of becoming, in our words, a culture architect. So Gustavo, welcome to the Culture Architects podcast.
Thank you, David. Thank you for hosting me. I'm very excited to talk to a fellow architect, culture architect, and designer and see where this conversation takes us.
Absolutely. So let's just go back to the beginning. My understanding from your background, Gustavo, and you can correct me if I don't have this absolutely correct, is that your original background was more in advertising and marketing. Is that right?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, that's how I got started on more the strategy kind of a point, and then I ended running like agencies. But that's exactly what shifted me to culture work.
Well, that's really where I want to go first. Is so you're in marketing, executive strategy. How do you get from there to culture work? Like, what happened that something happened, perhaps that all of a sudden opened your eyes and say, wait a second, this culture thing's pretty darn important. Tell me, like, where did that come from?
First, I think everyone is part of the culture, and we are going to get into that because culture is not just designed and created and architected by leaders or consultants, but also by people, right? So I experienced culture like an employee, then as a CEO in which I screw up. So I say, well, I need to learn from my own mistakes. But also I realized when advising clients, organizations wanted to be more creative, more innovative, more agile. I realized that most companies have more ideas and talent than they think they have. What they lacked was really the right culture, a conducive culture that would make those ideas see the light of day. So at some point I say, I'm fighting the wrong problem, right? These guys don't need more ideas from us. What they need is to rethink how the culture they have can make those ideas actually thrive.
So if I were to paraphrase, and you tell me if I have this right, what you're really saying is that inside of a group of people, a company in this case, there's this like latent power or capability that maybe is not being unleashed fully, and that you started to see that the culture was perhaps the engine or created the opportunity to unleash this latent power that was in the organization. Is that an accurate way of describing what you're saying?
It's more than accurate. It's brilliant. So you said about it. Thank you. Then definitely, it's like people tend to think of culture as something like it's nice to have and soft, but they forget that culture is the foundation of everything, right? People like to see I'm looking at my backyard and like to see the grass, the lawn, it looks great, it looks green, but they forget that if the soil is not fertile, then you're not going to get the results you want, the plants you want, the trees you want, the fruits you want. And this is happening today with AI a lot. So I see a lot of organizations pushing for AI adoption, becoming AI first, whatever the term they use. But in the end, they forget that rewarding, like giving people a bonus for using more AI, it's not really going to make the culture more conducive. Actually, there's research that shows that when it comes to Gen X, around 40% of people are boycotting their own organization AI programs, right? So pushing people to do something, pushing people to be more creative, more agile, more AI, first won't make it. You need to work on the system. That's the culture.
Right. So as you started to think about, okay, this culture thing's pretty darn important and might be certainly one of the keys, if not the most important key to sort of unleashing this latent power in the organization. You started to see this. What was the first thing you did? I know somewhere in here you created your culture design canvas, which I'd like to learn more about. Was that the first thing you did, or did that come later? What was the first thing you did as you said, all right, I'm focusing on the wrong problem. The real problem is the culture. What next? What do you do?
Yeah, great question. I like how you put it, because people usually would say, no, I came up with this model, and then since that, and that's not how things work, right? And that's why people get frustrated. We need to do a lot of trial and error before getting into that. In my case, I started experimenting. I went to Stanford to study first design thinking and then change leadership and getting to the principles of a human-centered design. And then I say, well, I need to apply this to culture. Now, first, I started applying, of course, to pure innovation, creating new services, new products. But then I say, we could apply the same principles, focusing on the user, the employees, the managers, not just the senior leaders, in order to develop the right culture. And I tried a lot of things. And at some point, I was losing opportunities on new clients because, hey, I need you to have a framework. What's your no? Because I like to have many frames. So that's how I came up with the canvas.
Well, you know, in some respects, it's similar to my own story, in that I had, as many of our listeners know, I had run a company for many years that was very, very successful, and our culture was the cornerstone of it. But at the time that I was doing that, I wasn't necessarily thinking about any kind of framework or anything. I was just doing things that made sense to me. And it was when I wrote my first book, Fundamentally Different, that I thought about, well, what did we do? Well, I guess we defined what we wanted our culture to be, and we hired the right people, and we trained them, and we did this, and we did these 8 different things that I actually thought about in the shower one day. And that became what we now call the 8-step framework, which is so foundational to all the things that I teach, this framework. But the framework wasn't something that I created in advance. It was a retrospective look at what I had been doing. And I realized, I guess I had been doing these 8 different things. But I do find, as I'm sure you have with your canvas, that putting it inside of a framework makes it easier for people to understand it and use it. That, I hear often people will say to me when they learn the 8-step framework that, gee, we've been doing a lot of these different things, but we never had a way of organizing what we were doing into an easier way. And so I do think sometimes frameworks make it easier to organize in our brain the things we need to do. They're artificially created, but they do create an organizing mechanism.
Absolutely. And I wonder why we haven't met before. But great that we're having this conversation. I totally agree. First of all, I like to tell people that we need frameworks to organize thinking and ideas that already exist. But in the end, frameworks are like lenses that we use to see reality. They're not reality, right? And sometimes people get stuck and they get confused. To your point, I get a lot of clients. I was having yesterday a call that, hey, help me create my culture. I said, you don't create culture. It already exists. The moment there are some interactions between people, they're already unwritten norms. There's a sense of belonging or not. There's some kind of purpose. You're making decisions, whether, to your point, they're being intentional or maybe informal. Maybe it's the right way, maybe it's the wrong way, but it's already happening. So frameworks should help surface what's currently working, but also help you choose what you want to continue having, what you want to stop doing, and what you want to improve the way you interact, right?
So when I'm interested in your comment about whether we create a culture or design a culture, because certainly to your point, cultures exist, whether you're creating it or not, it's there. To your point, people are operating, they're connecting with each other, they're making decisions, they're relating to each other in a certain way. So it's there. And my point of view, at least, and I'm curious about yours, is that while that is true, the whole point is we're trying to create the best organization we can. And so that means we need to find a way to be able to design what we want it to be, which some of it may be what it is today, and some of it may not be what it is today. So do you have a point of view that we can and should ultimately design what we would like the culture to be. It's happening anyway right now, but ought we not to be designing what we want?
No, I agree. Let me clarify. First of all, I use the term culture designer when I talk about myself and the people I train. You use architect. It's the same. My wife is an architect, so I don't want to. But in the end, we're talking about the same. But when you're the architect of something, you don't start from scratch. Right? There's already a space. If you're remodeling a house, the house already has some structure. If you're building a house from scratch, there's already a piece of land that has some limitations, some obstacles, some trees. So we need to understand what's already in there and build from that. To your point, when I started talking about designing culture, a lot of people, and hopefully they're watching this because we became friends, they started pushing back and say, no, culture happens. Well, yeah, it happens, but we can put some guardrails, we can put some intention, we can put some direction, but also we need to see what helps us get where we want and what doesn't.
Yes.
And for example, many patterns maybe were like for startups, they were great when you were under 100 people, but then when you keep growing and becoming more complex, well, you need to change how you make decisions. Maybe the role of the founder shouldn't be as preeminent as it become when you scale, right? For example.
Got it. So talk me through, you created this culture canvas concept. So explain, what is a culture canvas and how does an organization use that concept?
Yeah. The canvas is a visual tool. So I learned in Stanford about the power of visual elements so people can bring all their thoughts together. And it started organically. Basically, I was struggling with finding a definition for culture. There are many, but all fall short. So I said, what if instead of trying to define culture, I focus on what does culture encompass? So when we talk about culture, what are we talking about when we talk about culture? Often people think about maybe values, maybe behaviors. I think there's more than that. So I came up with 10 blocks. So the culture design canvas has 10 building blocks: purpose, values, behaviors, or you name it, no? But also decision-making, rules and norms, feedback. And as I continued to work on it, I realized that there were 3 key structures. So they weren't just random blocks. There was one part that was the long-term vision of culture, the foundation, your purpose, your values, your behaviors. That's what I call the alignment portion. So it's what we want to pull in that same direction. Then there's belonging, the emotional side, feedback, rituals, psychological safety. And lastly, more functional elements of how we work together, from norms and rules, decision-making and meetings, both asynchronous and synchronous. And that's why I came up with the ABCs of culture. So now I talk about the canvas represents the alignment, belonging, and collaboration, which are the ABCs on culture. I didn't start there. It evolved and then it surfaced. That's the approach I also use with my clients.
So you're looking for the patterns that emerge out of that. So describe, how does somebody then use that canvas?
There are many uses, but the most important tools are to understand what's the current state. So we do what we call mapping sessions with different teams to surface what's already there, especially because we can do it with startup, because I say that the moment you have 5 people interacting, there's a culture happening. But with larger organizations, we do it across departments to see what are the patterns, how do they make decisions, how does feedback gets not only the performance review, but different feedback practices, how feedback is perceived, and so on and so forth. Then we integrate all those canvases per department or countries to find what are the commonalities, the differences and gaps. And also we use that tool to design the future state. So we zoom into each of the building blocks and design them.
It reminds me a little bit, as I'm listening, to work that I had done in my first company many years ago, and basic, thing many people are familiar with, the whole lean thinking approach, and being able to map a process and say, here's how it works today, and then look at that process and say, let's design how we want that process to be and where are the gaps between how the process works today and where we want it to be, and then how do we change that. It sounds in some ways a similar kind of, it's a different topic, but a similar kind of mapping of this is how it happens today and what's good about that and what's not so good about that and how would we want it to happen. Is that a apt analogy?
Yes, yeah, and that's perfect. And also, if people are familiar with the business model canvas from Alex Osterwalder, that he focused on similar tools, but for designing a business model. Well, my tool serves the same purpose and follows the same pattern, but for culture.
Got it. So, I'm interested in your comment, and I want to expand upon this, that as soon as you have at least 5 people, there's a culture. Whether, and I similarly agree and say often that whether it's a group of friends that you play golf with or a church group or people you go fishing with, whatever, there's a culture in that group, an unwritten set of rules or norms of how the group operates. And in my workshops, I like to help people to think about that fact and think about, well, where does the culture come from? Since a group of friends in informal groups like that, they're not designing anything intentionally, at least, or consciously, but the culture is there. And one of my observations, and I try to help people to see this, so I'm curious about your point of view on this, is that in the absence of any particular intentional effort on somebody's part, which again, would typically be the case in an informal group, that the culture of the group tends to be heavily influenced or perhaps disproportionately influenced by the strongest personalities in the group. That there's always somebody, 1 or 2 people, who just have an outsized influence just by the nature of their personality, and they tend to set or establish many of the norms for how the group operates, just informally, just because of the way they are. Does that match your experience, or do you have a different point of view? So in an informal group, like a group of friends, how does a culture get established?
Yeah, I think that the most vocal or the strongest personalities tend to dictate some of those patterns. However, the most silent person also shapes culture, but in a less visible way.
Yes.
So, and that could be that they go along, but they're not happy. So at some point, the team suffers from that, or they could also start to boycott some of the behaviors that the majority wants to do. So this is something that's really interesting when it comes to group dynamics, that there's a difference between what we observe and what's happening under the surface. And sometimes we don't see the revolution or the discontent happening until when we observe it, it's a little bit too late.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right on. And the way that I like to describe that is there is always somebody who has a stronger or disproportionate influence. It is often, but to your point, not always the loudest person. There are people who are quiet influencers, but there are some people who are more influential than other people. And they tend to set the tone for how the group is going to operate. And the reason I like to point that out for people is that in my experience, if we understand that, my observation is that in a company setting, if we transfer that thought to a company setting, if the company isn't purposely designing what they want the culture to be and in some manner influencing it, it will get influenced by the most dominant personalities. And some of those people may not be the people we want influencing it. Sometimes those people, my experience is they're not always the managers and supervisors. They're just people with more dominant personalities. And if those people happen to be fantastic people, wonderful. But what if they're not? What if some of the stronger personalities are, pardon the expression, but cynical jerks with lousy attitudes? Those jerks will influence the people around them to be more like them, which is a costly error.
Yeah, Bob Sutton in one of his books calls them assholes. No, sure, God. But yeah, you're right, definitely. Yeah, maybe that's a great point, that sometimes we put everyone on the same box, right? And not every loud person is bad. right? So, there's a lot of conversation about the people who are more extroverted or more vocal. We need to silence them. That's no, and the silent people are the poor, more smart people in the room. Not necessarily. There are some trends, but to your point, sometimes the loudest voices are the right ones, and sometimes they're not. So if you're not being intentional how to architect that culture, it can go off rails pretty quickly, and then it's harder to get back.
Yeah.
To reel it in. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about your latest work and your new book, Forward Talk. So what happened that caused you to maybe tune into this recognition of the conversation debt that you've noticed and described in the book? So somewhere you started to pick up on the fact that there are conversations that aren't happening in organizations and that there's a big cost to that. What caused you to start to see that and to say, I need to address this more strongly with your latest book?
Yeah. If you haven't already noticed, I'm talking to you, but also the audience, I'm really obsessive about patterns. And I tend to focus more than try to see what should happen versus I try to connect the dots, what's happening. And one of the things that I realize is, why is it that in many organizations, they hire really smart people, really talented people, most of them with a positive intent, with the willingness to grow and contribute. And then in the end, things go south really, really bad. And of course, there are egos. Of course, we can explain the human dynamics that always power and stuff. But in the end, I realized that people don't know how to have the right conversations. So most people, especially in executive positions, they were never trained how to have a good conversation. Actually, they were trained to avoid them. And when I say conversations, I'm not talking about coaching people about the right language, the right moment. I'm talking more about the patterns that affect those conversations, that when we don't use them effectively, then collaboration suffers, alignment suffers. So basically, the conversational depth is the price we pay for the things that we don't address when we move too quickly, when we dance around the issues, or we keep blaming people instead of trying to fix what's not working.
And so in your book, you talk about some of the reasons that those conversations don't take place. Share with our audience some of why don't, I mean, we know we should have these conversations. We also know we don't have them. So nobody's doubting that that the fact that those conversations don't take place. So what are some of the major contributors to why don't we have those conversations that are so important?
First, as I mentioned, people are not trained, right? So it's a basic, our work is results from conversations. Like you and I, we're creating something, we're creating an episode for your podcast, and it's a conversation. And if we don't know how to interact, then people are going to say, you know what, next episode, boom, gone. So if we are having a meeting, having an agenda doesn't guarantee, actually, usually agendas get in the way for people to produce any result. We need to facilitate the conversation. Who are the right people that we need to bring in? What's the purpose of the meeting? How do we design it? How we can prepare to that meeting? And in many cases, that doesn't happen. So training people how to do it, it's easy. Second, we tend to think, and many leaders tend to think, that issues will disappear if you don't address it. And they usually associate a problem with the person who raises the issue. So we know they kill the messenger. Yeah, the messenger says, we're losing the battle, the war. You're still going to lose the war. You can kill the messenger, but the war is still going to be lost, right? So that's the other element. Another thing that's important, I work with many executive leaders that are afraid of starting a conversation. They don't want to, first, they want to be perceived as bad because everyone wants to be liked. We're human beings, and especially leaders, they want to be loved by their people. So why raise an issue? If they're not happy with their team or with one colleague, they stay silent. However, I always tell them the other person knows. If someone's having a performance issue, if you're always looking at them like, oh my God, you're frustrated, they can read your body language. if the team is not delivering results and you keep yelling, whatever, even if you don't have the conversation, they know. So they're waiting for you to start that conversation. You're not the only one who's feeling anxious or tense.
Mm-hmm. So in the system that I created and we teach, we focus on a set of behaviors that we teach organizations to practice, where we help them decide what those behaviors should be in their organization, what they want, and then how to create a way to practice them and teach them over and over so that they become internalized. And there are, while every company is different, there are certain behaviors that I have observed are almost required for organizations to work well and to be effective. And many of them relate to this whole topic of communication, because you and I have both seen that almost every, I say this is an arbitrary number, but at least 90% of all issues that I see in organizations at the end of the day are just about communication. If we just communicated more effectively, we'd solve that problem. And so there are a number of behaviors that we like to teach. We call them fundamentals that relate to that. There's one that we call, you'd appreciate, we call it practice blameless problem solving. And teaching organizations how to look at issues and say, well, how do we solve it? And what do we learn? And how do we improve from that? And it's not about the person, it's about the process. And how do we learn from that? There's another one that we call, that I learned from another person that I had interviewed for our podcast. His name is Lloyd Fickett, taught me 25 years ago a series of practices for how people relate to each other, very similar, that is called the collaborative way. And it's a series of largely communication tools for unleashing that power in an organization, because he had a similar experience to you, that there is this latent power in the organization and it's just getting wasted because people don't know how to relate to each other. And he created a set of 5 practices that I learned 25 years ago and have been foundations of my own thinking and have become some of our fundamentals. But 2 of them, one of them is called speaking straight, which is having honest, clear, direct conversations in a way, and you'll appreciate the language he used. Lloyd always used to teach in a way that his phrase was, that forwards the action. Very similar to your forward talk idea, that it's not just having honest conversations for the sake of having honest conversations or for dumping on people. The whole point is to move things forward. And that requires us to have that conversation in a particular way, not just dumping on people. So there's a whole set of skills around that, which I know you teach as well. There's another part to that, though, that he talks about as well, that is another fundamental, and we call it listen generously. Because my experience is that we can encourage people to have honest, direct, forwarding conversations, but if nobody listens very well, they quickly learn, I'm not going to bother doing that because nobody listens anyway. So why should I bother speaking? And I know in your book you talk about that fact that, a lot of the reason that people don't speak up often is because they've learned nobody listens anyway. So why bother speaking up? So expand a little bit on that, your experience or research on that idea that if we don't do anything with the conversation, people stop speaking up. I know that's part of your research as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I call it the pointlessness paradox, right? Usually we attribute fear for people not speaking up, right? And there's been a lot of conversation about we need to be safe or feel safe in our context, which it's important. But if we wait for the right moment, the right environment, then we're never going to have a conversation. And actually, if you're not in a so safe environment, how do you change it? To your point, if you don't address it, like your colleague said, speaking straight in a way that forwards that action. So backward patterns are when people say, for example, I'm asked to complete the engagement survey once or twice a year, and I keep sharing my concerns or maybe contributing with ideas or maybe saying this is good about the company, but why did we stop doing X, Y, and Z? Great. Then nothing happens. So I keep answering the same stuff. The leaders say, great, thank you guys. We got an 80% a response rate. Thank you for sharing, but then nothing changes. What's the point? And one thing that's relevant here is that even in very safe environments, we get that people find the right context to share their ideas, to ask questions, to challenge their bosses, and their bosses look very receptive. But in the end, they don't change their minds. So people say, yeah, the atmosphere is great, but I'm not going to continue contributing. So people go silent or start filtering, which is even worse, because if they're silent, something's going on. When they're not being honest, that's even worse. To wrap it up, I call it a paradox, because if you stop speaking up, nothing will definitely change. So you're basically shooting yourself on the foot.
Yeah. So when we talk about leaders, you mentioned, Gustavo, that in your experience and research that leaders don't know how to start the conversation often. So what advice would you give to leaders to, I know there's something I need to address. It's uncomfortable for me, but I know it needs to happen. What advice would you give people for how do you start a difficult conversation?
I'm thinking I just published an article on the topic, so I'm trying to see things that I haven't covered already. One is start with curiosity, right? So it's not that you're not right, but many times leaders have an assessment of what's going on with a person, with a team that's not 100% right or accurate. So if you start saying, hey guys, you're doing this and we need to change this, people are never going to engage in the solution because they don't buy the assessment. So start by, hey guys, this is what I'm seeing. We're not moving as fast. We're procrastinating. We are rehashing every decision, whatever's the problem, and say, do you see what I'm seeing? What am I missing? Who else see what I'm seeing? So try to build an agreement on the context and be open to maybe the context is not 100% as you see it. When people find common ground, it's easy to say, okay, now let's move into what needs to happen. That's one.
That's a fascinating point, because I can easily see how if you're sharing something with me and I don't, to use your word, I don't agree with the assessment, we're so far apart from the beginning that it's going to be pretty hard for us to have a meaningful conversation after that if we have completely different points of view about what's really going on here. Interesting. One of the things that I have found, and advice I often give to leaders or anybody, not just leaders, but about having what we call straight conversations, is sometimes just acknowledging the discomfort or the awkwardness. So if I say to you, Gustavo, I got to tell you, this is a really hard conversation for me, but there's something that I think it's really important for us to talk about. Announcing or letting you know that this is difficult for me, one, in my experience, sometimes gives me the courage to go deeper into it. And two, I think that often when we go into a difficult conversation, one of our fears is that I might mess this up because I'm uncomfortable and I don't know how to say this right, and I might mess it all up and then you're going to get all upset, and so we avoid it. So my experience is that if I let you in on the fact that this is difficult for me and awkward and that I might not do this perfectly, you're more likely to give me a little bit more room here, and you're less likely to misinterpret my intention because you know that this is difficult for me. And so just announcing that allows us, that vulnerability often allows us to go deeper into the conversation with less fear that my messiness about it might screw up the situation.
Yeah, I agree. And there are many things related to that. First of all, if people ask me, well, how do you learn not to worry? How do you, and I say, like, even I'm the expert, so-called expert on the topic, I also struggle with that because we're human beings. Yes. The point is not that the discomfort is going to go away. It's about getting used to it. To your point, first, you need to have the conversation with yourself and acknowledge how you're feeling and say, it's okay. It's not bad to actually, if you weren't feeling anything, it's because you're not human. Second, to your point, if you acknowledge that with your colleague or with your team, that's going to lower expectation because we are sharing the same emotion, right? Also, you're not a sociopath that basically had no emotions, and right? But the other thing is, to your point, and we discussed this before kicking off the recording, you talk about, hey, let's be spontaneous. I don't like to be scripted, right? Let's go with the flow. When leaders over-prepare and when they sound over-scripted, then they look and sound and people feel they're not being authentic. No, it feels like, what's the trap? No, you're having this nice context and opening, and people say, okay, where is coming? What's the surprise? The bad news? What's the hidden agenda? Versus make mistakes. It doesn't matter. If you're being honest, if you're acting out of positive intent and you want to find common ground, people will forgive all the mistakes you make. But if you're over prepared, they're definitely going to be very, very defensive.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I like what you said about curiosity too, and going into a conversation, really wanting to understand. So what is the other person's point of view about this? Because certainly that creates an openness for the dialogue. If I don't come in, to your point, scripted and believing I know what's going on here, but even to acknowledge that I have a point of view or a bias or a way of looking at this, but I'm open to hearing your point of view and understanding. Maybe I'm missing it. Maybe I don't understand the whole story. Certainly invites the other person to be a participant in that conversation.
It also shows that you care, right? Yeah. You're not there to judge them or criticize them. You want them to thrive. So because people need to read your intention, are you trying to help them or are you trying to accelerate them quitting or you firing them, right?
Yeah.
What's the intent?
Fascinating. So I'm always curious about anybody who's been doing something for a while, like you. There are things that you used to think, when you started doing culture work, there were things that you probably, I'm guessing about this, and it's okay if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that there were things that you originally thought as you were going into this. And now, having worked on it for a number of years, you look back and say, boy, I was naive about that. It's really different than I thought. What are some things that you used to think that you don't think anymore?
I used to think that culture could be good or perfect or whatever, or have a more idealized version of culture. I'm more into any improvement is progress. I'm more into working less in the culture as one construct. I'm more into culture as the sum of subcultures. So focusing more on the different teams, the different groups, of course, finding that a common conductive tissue, right, that brings them together, the purpose. But in the end, depending on the function, depending on the team leading, we need to give them room to breathe. So I'm focusing more on that and try to make a more single-minded kind of culture for everyone, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's interesting. Your comment about used to thinking that, we could make it perfect, and now just accepting that any improvement we make is better than where we were before. This person, Lloyd Fickett, used to say that about the collaborative way, and I say it about our process of creating fundamentals, as we call them, that at any level that people are practicing this is better than they would have been before. And sometimes it's frustrating when you see people that they don't embrace all of this, or maybe they do embrace it, but they don't practice it as effectively as they could. And you see the gaps, and then you realize, well, at the end of the day, this is better than they would have been before. And so anything they do, heading in the right direction, is going to make them a better organization, better people than they would have been before.
Yeah.
So as we wrap this up, it's been a fascinating conversation. Talk a little bit more about your latest work, your book, and if people want to learn more about the book as well as your canvas, how would they find out more about you, Gustavo?
Sure. I mean, the book is available in major online and brick and mortar retailers, so you can look it for Amazon or Barnes and Nobles, whatever, Forward Talk. Okay. And if you don't want to reach out, they can go to my website, GustavoRazzetti.com, or let's connect on LinkedIn. I'm the only Gustavo Razzetti with double Z, double T. So it's going to be easy to find me. Yes. I'm based in Florida. So you're going to find me there and reach out. I mean, sometimes, I have a weekly blog where I'm sharing insights and articles with very practical tips and tools that people can apply, including my Canvas. I have a lot of free downloads or tools that you can start applying right away with not only the template, but also the instructions, because I want to help people build those skills themselves and not just depend on me. And of course, if you're looking for someone to help you with your team culture, please reach out as well.
Great. And we'll make sure that we include that in the show notes as well, so that people have that information. Gustavo, it's been fascinating to hear your journey and to learn more about the way you approach this topic. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to have you.
Awesome. Thank you, David, for hosting me. And I learned a lot from you. I like conversations are two ways. And that's something that also leaders need to understand. You're not into imposing your view. You need to have a chat. And here we are. We are two practitioners learning from each other and helping others grow their cultures.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that wraps up today's episode of Culture Architects. If you're enjoying these conversations, subscribe on your favorite platform and also consider leaving a quick review, and that way other culture-minded leaders can find the show. And for more tools on building a high-performing culture in your organization, visit CultureWise.com. See you next time on Culture Architects.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.